hello again. Our numbers have slightly dwindled, at least temporarily, but that's okay. As long as some people come and want to learn, that's fine. I don't need numbers. I don't need to get numbers, so that's okay. Okay, so last week we were sort of talking about the transition from traditional Jewish communities into modern era, getting into the 19th century. Today, we're going to focus on the 19th century and early 20th century, really before World War I. But I thought I might do a little bit of more systematic reviewing of last week's lecture, which went all over the place. So last week we talked about the traditional Jewish community, and in political terms, I think you'd probably call it right wing or conservative. I mean, you're familiar with the right to left distinction, very common these days. I mean, well, it actually comes from the French Revolution and where people were sitting at that time. But in a traditional Jewish society, you know, everybody is nominally Orthodox. There was no such thing as reform until the 19th century, and you know, just about everybody was traditional or supposed to be traditional. So it's hard to know what people actually did, but there were certainly no non-Orthodox synagogues. And there were, you know, generally restrictions on where Jews could live, and especially in Eastern Europe, there were, even though Jews don't become citizens in Russia until the end of World War I, nevertheless, there are lots of special laws pertaining to Jews. For example, laws as to where they could or couldn't live, or laws about sometimes about what clothes they had to wear under certain circumstances, and there are, and then there was conscription. That was the worst law, as far as the Jews were concerned, the worst law that was passed in the 1820s under Tsar Nicholas I. And we don't have to go into it right now or right here, but that was a terrible thing for Jews. Why? Why don't Jewish, I guess no parents really like conscription, but I mean, if someone wants to fight in the army, you can volunteer. But why was conscription into the army, what becomes known as the Cantonist system, which I'll explain, but why did Jewish families, Jewish parents, so dislike, hate, despise conscription?
So my understanding of that era is that unlike any draft system that has existed in this country, the conscription was for 20 years.
Or 25 sometimes.
25 years?
Whatever, I mean, it was a long period.
So if you sent your child to the Russian military, there was a good chance you might never see them again. And parents did everything to keep their kids out of the Russian military.
Yeah, you know, you can look at draft dodgers during the Vietnam War. Some of them, you know, had medical excuses, or damaged fingers or feet or something like that, just pretended to anyhow, so that they could get drafted. Well, it's much worse in the 19th century for Jews. No Jew would have volunteered for the Russian army, because being part of the army, that's true anywhere, it was very difficult to maintain Jewish laws. And to say it mildly, I mean, today in let's say the American army, you can get kosher food or vegetarian food, or you know, not possible in the Russian army. And you had, and they made things particularly difficult for Jewish kids. Now, Jewish kids were certainly not well prepared to go into the army. They were supposed to be drafted at 18, but in the eras of after 1827, there was something called the cantonist system, where kids were taken into the army often against their will, against the will of their parents, and they were kidnapped essentially, to send them into the army because their parents were involved with them. So, and then they're sent away for essentially for life. Okay. And in many cases, they didn't survive because they were not in good physical shape to begin with, because athletics was not a Jewish thing then. It isn't quite now either, but some Jews are very athletic, and then no Jews, as far as I can tell, were in any shape to join an army. So at any rate, it was really an awful thing to happen to a Jewish family, and it traumatized the Jewish community of Russia between 1827 and 1856, when it was formally ended. But the memory of it lives on. So some people, talk about their grandparents, escaping from being drafted into the Russian army. Well, yes, we might have grandfathers who had to serve in the Russian army in the early 20th century, and he didn't volunteer, but it wasn't under the cantonist laws. They had to serve regular service in the army, like 2 years or 3 years or whatever it might have been. And anyway, Eastern Europe Jews were forced into things. They had to follow rules, but they had absolutely no rights in society, except they had the right to live in their own communities. And they did, and the communities were, as I was trying to describe that last week, communities were very traditional. And so I would call it, they were traditional Orthodox, or sometimes you would even call them ultra-Orthodox, what you would call Haredi, I guess, in Israel today. But I find ultra-Orthodox works better for me, although it's probably the same thing. So there are different degrees of practice, but everyone in Eastern Europe was not a citizen and restricted where they could live and what they could do for a living. And so there is emancipation does not come to Eastern Europe until the 19th century, and then it doesn't get to, it gets to Eastern Europe in the 20th century, and not in the 19th century. So we'll get to Eastern Europe in the 20th century eventually, but we're not dealing with it now. Okay, so, but it will be the case that Jews rarely support conservative political parties. Why is that? Why do they not support conservative political parties?
I think they see liberal parties as more accepting of minorities.
Well, Jews are about the only minority in Europe, unfortunately. So yes, Jews support liberalism, okay, liberals. Now, a European definition of liberals is not quite the same as an American definition of liberals, but what is so attractive to Jews about liberalism as opposed to conservatism? In other words, why are Jews more likely to be on the left, center, or center-left than they are to be on the right?
They want to be accepted as part of the peoplehood of whatever country.
Yeah, they want civil rights. They want the right to vote. Often nobody had the right to vote in the 18th century, but they wanted rights. They wanted rights to not only to vote in elections, but to be able to be candidates for elections. They wanted to get out of the special laws that affected them as Jews and become equal citizens under the regular laws. But of course, that meant in practice giving up their special rights as a separate entity in a separate corporation, sort of, in a given society. But in exchange, they got individual rights, gave up group rights, and all the special things that pertain to Jews, for good or for bad, usually for bad, but sometimes for good. They wanted to get rid of all of those special laws that pertain to Jews and live like just about everybody else and be part of the political system like anybody else. And emancipation is generally introduced into Western countries by the liberals. And insofar as Jews support any political parties in the mid to late 19th century in Central or Western Europe, they're more likely to support parties on the left, center left actually. Liberals are generally, let's have a definition of liberal. Where are they on the political spectrum? Left. Moderate left. They are center left. It depends on where they are and who they are, okay? But it's sort of the middle of the road. Eventually, when we talk about Zionism, you'll see that the general Zionists, anybody left over from all the other groups that existed, general Zionists came in A's and B's. General Zionist A was more towards the right, and General Zionist B was more towards the left. And that they're in the middle, so that's the middle is divided. But the liberals, what would a platform of a liberal party be in the 19th century?
Anti-slavery.
Oh, talking Europe.
I got a cookie in my mouth.
But, I mean, you're right for the American scene, but in Europe, officially, they don't have slavery. In Europe, they get rid of slavery in the early 19th century to the extent that they had it before, but they never had anything that looked quite like American slavery, which, was.
Would it be fair trade? Owning
Well,
property?
They want fair trade, they want equal, they want unrestricted commerce, essentially.
Be able to take whatever professions they like and not be restricted. Also land ownership.
Well, land ownership, they sort of get de facto, but for a long time, Jews were not allowed to own land, and especially in Eastern Europe. But in Central Europe is also true. The Jews were not agricultural at all. What did Jews do for a living?
Trade.
Lent money.
What?
Lent money.
No, that's
Down
medieval.
money to
That-
lend.
No, lending money is medieval. There's still some bankers in the 19th
They're
century.
traders, they're salesmen, they're commerce.
Yeah, they're middle class, middle class. They tend to own small properties maybe, but they earn their living by commercial activities. You don't have Jewish professionals yet, but you do have Jewish merchants, traders, peddlers. I mean, at all different levels, Jews dealt in trading goods. And that was their role in society and had been for quite a long time. So free trade for them was that they could get real, get paid reasonably well for what they were selling, and that they could afford to buy the stuff too, so they could sell it. I mean, they wanted a system which would be fair and egalitarian and not treat them differently. And so the liberals, especially in Central Europe, are the ones who will eventually grant emancipation to Jews. Now, what are we talking about when we say emancipation? I started to tell you, but got sidetracked.
Sorry. Be able to travel freely.
Oh, well, Jews could travel, they might get killed on the road,
Yeah.
but they could travel freely. They had to travel because Jews traveled a lot. These Jewish traders often went door to door to sell things, or they were Jews before the modern era. Jewish men. Often when I say Jews, I really mean Jewish men. If I mean Jewish women, I'll indicate, but we'll talk about women briefly sometimes. But Jewish men traveled a lot. They spent a lot of time away from their families. Even if they were peddlers, they would head out on Sunday morning and come back for Friday afternoon. They would generally come back for Shabbos if they could, but and Shabbat still, maintains importance even when Jews, start to be, more reform or radical in their practices. It's interesting how Shabbat often is kept in some form. Okay. However, liberals, so liberals were the party of the essentially the rising middle class, and also it's not, it's not the agricultural people who are peasants, and they don't have any political rights anyhow. But when they do get political rights, they will not support a liberal party, because the party of the landowners was the conservative party, whatever you call them. I'm just using these terms. So it was landowners, the wealthy, established people had, up until the French Revolution, they had essentially their value was in land, not in money. Now, Jews dealt in money.
Harriet,
Yes.
did emancipation pave the way for Jews to get an education? Because most of the people that you're talking about were not educated.
Mhm.
They were street smart, but not, they weren't getting in the universities.
No, they don't go to the universities until they started to get to universities in the 1850s and 60s, basically in the mid-19th century. But those are only the wealthy elite, basically. But Jews are not, Jewish boys are not illiterate. All women were basically couldn't read, were not formally trained to read and write, but Jews always sent their sons to Cheder, which was obvious. Sometimes the conditions were terrible, but just about every Jewish boy was from early morning till later in the daytime, went to Cheder. I went to a school that was often referred to as a Cheder, used differently. Than it would be used now. It's not an after-school thing. It's a full-day thing. But what do they teach? What do they learn in the Cheder?
Torah.
And Yiddish.
They spoke Yiddish. They don't learn Yiddish. They speak Yiddish, and all Eastern European Jews continue to speak Yiddish, most of them, until the 20th century. Okay, some know a second language, and they often do know second languages in order to make a living. And certainly when they go to university, they have to know languages. But you're not taught any what we consider what was learned in American schools when they're set up, also in the early part of the 19th century. I mean, eventually get public schools and what have you. In public schools, they teach reading, writing, and arithmetic. In the Cheder, you don't. You only learn Jewish subjects. And you start with, the first thing you're learning Torah, books of Moses. You might get the Nevi'im, but probably not if you're in an elementary Cheder. And they're also taught prayers. They're taught to be able to read, not necessarily to understand Hebrew, but to learn about the Torah through reading the text, but not necessarily learning how to understand it. Hebrew was not a spoken language at that time, and nobody formally studied Hebrew as a language. So kids would go to a Cheder, especially in Eastern Europe, and to some degree they'd go to community schools in Central Europe as well, where they'll learn in Yiddish, but the same curriculum will be taught in the early part of the 19th century. But Jewish boys go to school for how long?
The one that they could afford to go.
It's
So
not.
aren't they needed at home to work, whatever?
They will get to that at different stages depending on who they are and where they're coming from. Yes, Alex, you were gonna say something?
I thought maybe 13, they were,
Yeah, basically, up until sort of more or less bar mitzvah age, they are probably going to a cheder. If they're very bright, they would be going to a yeshiva. In other words, they would be studying more advanced subjects like Talmud. And they wouldn't do that in the cheder, they would go probably to study with a local rabbi or a rabbi in another town, and they would learn, study Talmud every day. And that's, but even if you go to, for Jewish higher education, i.e. go to a yeshiva, you're still only learning Jewish subjects. So how do you make a living learning Jewish subjects? I mean, it really is a case of those who can do and those who can't teach. Muhammad has a very low status in Jewish society. You know, anybody could be a Muhammad as long as they could read Hebrew, but they wouldn't necessarily be good. But sometimes they had been, before this era, there had been, you know, the wealthy had private tutors for their sons, sometimes for their daughters, more rarely. But they have private tutors who are teaching, I guess, more or less the same things, but maybe some more practical things as well. But what they learn about in order to make a living, they generally learn it by apprenticing or from their fathers. You do what your father did. And that was the way for all society at the time before education was formed. How else do you learn something? You learn it from the person closest to you who can teach it to you. Like girls learn from their mothers, well, boys learn from their fathers. And so they tend to follow in the path of the father, but they do have formal education. And certainly in Central Europe, which includes Germany and Austria-Hungary, in Central Europe, they start learning more secular subjects earlier than they do in Eastern Europe. And they also learn German. Formally learn German, beginning at the end of the 18th century, but more or less into the 19th century. They learn how to, read and write German, and sometimes they go to, they either tutored, or sometimes they'll go to schools, but they go to private Jewish schools, in order to train to learn. I mean, look, all Jewish boys who go into business of any kind, obviously, more arithmetic. They know how to buy and sell things in some system of money. And how do you learn that? I guess you watch your father for long enough and then you figure it out. And some women also worked outside the home and to help their husbands, but they would also go and knock on people's doors and sort of things. It was looked down upon, but you could do it because that was one of the few ways you could make a living. Another way to make a living is buying and selling things in the marketplace. And so that in many cases would be a local market, and women would participate with in certain kinds of commerce at a market. But when Jews enter the working force, they do so generally with very limited education. But that's true for everybody. That's the way the society worked. And in the course of the 19th century, you start getting public schools, and parents, especially in Central Europe, start sending their kids to public elementary schools and then to high schools. However, not everybody gets to high school level, but elementary school level, most Central European kids learn elementary education in a somewhat secular school. Sometimes these schools are run by the Jewish community, sometimes they're public schools.
Harriet,
Mhm.
during this time, were there still restrictions on where Jews could live?
Not so much in the Germanic states. I mean, the Germans, they were, when there was no country called Germany until 1871. So if I'm saying Germany, I don't really mean Germany as we know it, but I'm meaning all these different German principalities and bishoprics, and there were 360 of them. And that's that in at the time of the Napoleonic Wars. And each one has their own code of law, and no one rules about Jews, but they're similar, you know, and there's no uniformity. But the way Jews lived their lives was the same wherever they lived, but sometimes they had more freedom to more places where they're allowed to live, and sometimes they could be more successful in their endeavors. There is, of course, a wealthy Jewish class, often bankers, or people who were jewelers, trading, or so there is an elite that I think I was talking about last time. It's court Jews. Let's talk about anyhow. But that's a fairly small group. Most people were, worked in small town commerce. All right. So, but even, but when you don't get a formal education of any kind, you're likely to stay as traditional as your parents are, because that's how you grew up. It's only in the 19th century when people, men and then women, start to get secular educations that they can join the outside world. Otherwise, they're living in the Jewish world, speaking Yiddish, but dealing with the outside world, whether in Yiddish or German or whatever the language was around them. Okay, so but they are not really involved in public politics, although in Jews, the first political organization that the Jews are involved in, of course, is the Jewish communities. And as we know from last time, the people who led the Jewish communities were the rich. Mhm. And it's an oligarchy of sorts. But in certain places, Jews needed, before the 19th century, Jews needed a permission to live in any given state, and they were tolerated, quote unquote. There was an edict of toleration passed in Austria in 1781, that the Jews could live more or less where they wanted to live and knew more or less what they wanted to do to earn a living, with most of the restrictions were removed from them, but and that eventually becomes more common in other German-speaking lands, which is German-speaking lands were places where, well, Jews everywhere in Central Europe, when they stopped speaking Yiddish, basically started to speak German. And Jews everywhere in Europe knew German. It wasn't hard for them because they spoke Yiddish before. You have to make a transition, obviously, but you could do that. But they usually using more and more formal German rather than their own dialects of Yiddish before they start to get formal educations and go to schools and then go to universities. So, all right, so these were people still living in a pretty traditional Jewish lifestyle. Okay, now you get to the liberals. Well, you get the first rights for Jews, emancipation for Jews, civil rights, voting rights, etc., right to elected, etc. First happens in France, as I think I mentioned after the French Revolution. But even then, Jews weren't really fully emancipated by the French Revolution. The French Revolution in 1789, you know, didn't really, they issued the Declaration of the Rights of Man to include Jews. Jews had to be included by separate rulings to make them like everybody else. And even in France, they had to take different steps to emancipation. The Sephardic Jews, Jews originally from Spain, okay, who'd come to Europe. Jews were expelled from just about everywhere in Europe, various, off and on from various German states too, but not from all of the German states. France, it's after the French Revolution that everybody, all different classes in society, get equal rights, right? Declaration of Rights of Man. But before Jews could get it, they had to first give it to the Sephardi. And where is Sephardi living? How did Sephardi get to Western Europe?
Part of the world who accepted them at the time that they were expelled.
Well, yeah, but that was, there weren't so many places in Europe that accepted them. Although most of the people who left Spain in 1492 were not talking about it at all. They went to the Ottoman Empire, and some of them go to England, go to London. Some of them go to France, not Paris, but they go to southern France, Bordeaux and Bayonne. There had been some Jews living in Avignon throughout the Avignon belonged to the Pope. As a papal state, Jews could live in Rome, and so Jews could live in Avignon, not very well, but they could. So you first get these communities in southern France, and they, because they come from Spain where they were educated, and they rise up economically and they become quite well to do and quite like everybody else. And so those were people it was easier to give civil rights to than the Jews who were sort of moneylenders and traders and peddlers in other parts of France, like Alsace-Lorraine, which goes back and forth between Germany and France, and the German states and France. But the Jews of France, first the Sephardim, and then eventually the Ashkenazim, who are a lot poorer than the Sephardim, and who are, who still speak Yiddish, and France does not really want to give Jews civil rights, equal rights, but they decided to do so, more or less, because they didn't want to have separate corporations in society. In the medieval era, everybody was part of a different corporation, so to speak, okay, and governed by their own laws. Their status was defined, their class was defined by what group they belonged to, and they could be peasants, they could be burghers, they could be clergy, they could be, but everybody was under different laws in the Middle Ages. By now, after the French Revolution, everybody's supposed to be under the same laws, including the Jews, which was pretty good for the Jews, except Jews had to give up a lot to get these rights, and they didn't necessarily get them all at once. They had to give up their self-government, actually, to be under the French legal system. And the Jewish communities are reorganized into consistoires that were regional groups of Jews, and they used to be able to govern themselves according to Jewish law, but after emancipation, Jewish law has no official effect, as far as the state's concerned, on Jewish status. Something else about Napoleon. When he comes, he takes over after the French Revolution, and he didn't particularly like Jews. Well, not very many people did, but there was a whole controversy in France in the 18th century, in the 19th century, but whether Jews were like everybody else, or they were different, or whether they could be given equal rights, or whether they couldn't. Won't go into that. But even when they are given equal rights, they're sometimes treated differently. For example, when Napoleon puts a moratorium on debts that are owed to Jews. So, anybody who lent money to anybody, they don't have to pay it back. Isn't that nice? Jews don't get compensated in any way for this, but it just sort of happens overnight. And that was kind of inconvenient. So there's a moratorium on debts for Jews in about 1805, and they set up this consistorial system. And also the consistorial system actually was responsible for eventually for drafting Jews into the army, but at least they were citizens who they were drafting. I don't know how many of them actually served, but because usually Jews were able to pay their way out of it. But in the but Napoleon called everybody together in a body with an assembly of notables, and then comes known as the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin was ancient. I mean, it was the form of government in the land of Israel, in the ancient world, and there were 70 people belonging to it. Anyhow, but Napoleon wants Jews to return to the land of Israel, but he also wants them to be regulated. And the issues that he's asking, they put together all kinds of Jewish leaders from different parts of France and from Italy, and whoever was part of the Napoleonic Empire. And they asked them all kinds of questions as to, whether it's okay for Jews to intermarry, whether it's okay for Jews to, whether Jews allow divorce. Of course, Catholics don't allow divorce. Jews do. Whether, how loyal were they to the state? Were Jews more loyal to other Jews or to France? Well, they were told how to answer these questions. They were given a script they were supposed to read. These were leaders of the community, because they didn't answer totally honestly, put it that way. Of course, Jews were more likely to deal with other Jews more easily than they were with non-Jews, especially when they just been barely emancipated a couple of years before. So Jews in France get rights and but at first Napoleon tries to limit them in many ways, and he wanted Jews to intermarry. That way they would disappear. Well, all Christians wanted Jews to become Christians. The idea of giving them rights was that they could more easily be educated enough to become Christians. Anyway, that's France. But we probably won't deal much more with France. England, Jews were expelled from France in 1434 or something like that. They were expelled from England in 1290. And they don't get a right to come back until 1655. And the ones who come back, first the Sephardim were coming from Spain, and they're living as Catholics, first in England. But they become wealthy because they're educated, and they have all these connections with other Sephardim all over the place who import exporters types. So they're okay, but in terms of rights, well, there was a Jew bill, the Jew bill, that was issued in 1756, in other words, mid-18th century, that was supposed to give rights to Jews, but it got defeated in Parliament. So they didn't get rights officially then.
This is in England?
This is England, yeah. So The Jew bill was defeated in 1756, but then gradually Jews got the right to be, eventually first to be naturalized, to become British citizens, or British citizens wherever they lived. That was also true in the United States, and I mean, free United States, in the colonies. There, yeah.
So you say Jews were readmitted to England in 1655?
Yep.
And was it like Charles II? Is that the Charles II thing?
Yeah, it's in the Cromwell era.
It's before Charles II?
Yeah, it's Cromwell.
What motivated them to do this?
One of the motivations was because, you see, they understood that the Messiah wasn't going to come, i.e., second coming, until Jews lived in the four corners of the earth. Well, how does England become a corner of the earth? What do you call England in French? Yes. Angleterre, which means, it's a corner of the world, land in the corner, sort of geographically, but of course we know that the earth is not square, and you can't be living on the edge of the world there, why? But, all right, so, but they were allowed in because they were considered to be useful. In the 18th century, you have, instead of having all your value put in land, which had been the case in France, in England, they're shifting to putting value in money and a more capitalist system, so it's to build up. And Jews have good experience in that, especially Sephardic. Even Ashkenazi, they have, there are some that had come from farther east in Europe, and so both the Sephardic community and the Ashkenazi community eventually get to become British citizens like everybody else, but they couldn't, and this is true elsewhere too, they couldn't hold public office. Why not?
They couldn't swear.
They couldn't swear the oath according to Christian. They couldn't swear on a New Testament. And that's true virtually everywhere. Before they can get rights, they have to get around this swearing on the New Testament bit. So in the middle of the 19th century, one of the Rothschilds, Lionel Rothschild, gets elected to Parliament a number of times, but he's not allowed to take a seat until 1858. So that's the formal date for equal rights for Jews in England, but they were essentially enjoying this before. Now, I really want to get to the German states, however. It takes a lot longer for Jews living in in other parts of Central Europe, that's Germany and Austria-Hungary. It isn't until the 1860s that they're going to get anything, well, real rights. In 1812, they were supposed to get rights in Prussia, but they didn't quite get them, and they were taken away. And emancipation is something that can be given, but it can also be taken away, as people discovered during the Nazi era. Whatever rights the Jews had yesterday, they don't necessarily have today. And so it takes a long time for them to become citizens, and in the process, they have to deserve to become citizens. How do you deserve to become citizens? What do you have to do?
Pay for it.
No, you don't buy citizenship.
You have to pledge allegiance to the country.
Well, you got to prove that you're loyal to the country. It's not necessarily the American Pledge of Allegiance, but you had to prove that you were deserving of being a citizen. So that meant that you had to speak the language of the land, just like to get citizenship today, you have to pass language exams, okay? You have to know the language of the exam, you have to have a certain amount of education to deserve this, and you have to improve your relationship with the outside world. Well, Napoleon had a problem with money lending and Jews. Well, England, they don't have money lending, but they had to become respectable have to be like Protestants in this case, and do what they were supposed to do to deserve this, the rights of citizenship. Well, they get the, so in Germany, they get it, and when the unification of Germany becomes what country, and now I can use the word Germany after 1871, when Germany becomes one country and all have come on the same constitution, then Jews de facto become, on paper at least, equal citizens of Germany, this new country. Before that, there were attempts to emancipate Jews in Prussia and other places in Germany. As I mentioned, 1812 in Prussia, that's the largest German state, and most Jews lived in Prussia, mainly eastern part of Prussia, but I don't go into all that other stuff, but the Jews were emancipated in 1848, but then it was rescinded. There were a whole bunch of revolutions in Europe in 1848, mainly in large cities. And for the first time, you got Jews on the barricades. There's revolution going on, and you've got Jews who say they're fighting in the Hungarian army and they're fighting in the Austrian army, Hungarian, but anyway, the army of Hungary. And you've got Jews in Germany who are, served in the armed forces too. So this meant that you had to be a citizen in order to do that. I mean, you can't draft people who aren't citizens. In the United States you can, but it's a question of practice. So Jews don't get full official citizenship until 1867, and even then, in various parts of Germany, they're restricted. They can't be civil servants, basically. They can't take oaths, right? And they can't be judges. They can't be professors. They can be lawyers. They can't be professors. And there were still rights that they had to get, but by the late 19th century, they've gotten just about all the rights they're going to need. And this is all given to them by the German Liberal Party in 1871, 1872. And the liberals wanted to give Jews rights because they wanted Jews to become equal citizens and wanted to increase, they wanted to be able to sort of control the economic activities of Jews under one system, not having separate rules for Jews and separate rules for other groups. No, everybody's going to be equal under the law, and so Jews are emancipated finally in 1871. Now, unfortunately, in 1848, and I should have mentioned, there was a Frankfurt Parliament, and Jews were represented in that by someone named Gabriel Wieser, who was the first German Jewish politician, I suppose you could say, in the 19th century. And then there were the others, but not a whole lot in the 19th century. But but it was liberals who gave Jews rights, and of course, the party that Jews would vote for in any German election would be the Liberal Party, okay? which was again wanted people, compensate people who were urban, who were merchants, who were more rights to handle commercial affairs openly and these kind of things. So Jews become citizens, and in doing so, they become loyal to the liberal parties. There are also conservative parties in Germany, landowners, Prussian landowners. they were conservative, and when I call them conservatives, I mean that they wanted to maintain laws as of old. They did not want the system to change from what it had been before, so that they wanted the power of land to lie with the, um, with the landowners, the owners, and not give rights to anybody of lower status. Well, in the middle of the 19th century, the middle classes started to get rights. Pay a certain amount of taxes, you can vote in an election. If you're a peasant or a worker, you have to own a certain amount of property to be able to have vote in an election. That was true in the United States too. In the early years, you had to give certain economic status, and you don't get the right to vote in German elections until after 1871. You start to get the right to vote in municipal elections, and then eventually in regional elections, state elections, and the ability to not only to vote in an election, but also to run for office is a sign that Jews have become citizens. And in the United States too, that they first become politicians somewhere in the West. Yes.
How does Karl Marx and Marxism fit into this?
That's next week when we get to
All right.
socialism. Hey, don't jump too far ahead. But at the
She's
same
still
time,
in the 1800s. Marx is in the 1900s.
no, 19th century, he's in the 1800s.
Yeah.
He is in the 1800s, he's in the 19th century, in the 19th century.
Marx?
Yes, 1848 is it?
Because you mentioned the revolutions of
Yeah,
1848.
yeah, but he wasn't part of the revolution.
He was an obscure guy at that.
Yeah, he was living in England and he was writing books essentially.
I forget, I should know this, but was he Jewish?
Yes, of course.
Okay, well, there you go, so he fits into Jewish politics.
Marx.
How about his partner Engels?
No, Engels is
Engels
Engels,
was English.
but we'll get to them. Socialism are next.
Okay,
Right.
I'll save the questions then.
So before all this, when there was this conflict between the liberals and the landowners and everything like that, were the Jews a wedge issue? There were rights for Jews? Were the Christians?
Yeah, they were divided. Conservatives did not want Jews to get rights because they wanted to retain the older values of landed wealth. And that should be, what's it called? I don't know the proper term for it, I can't think of it. But the liberals are urban and willing to give rights to people who have a certain amount of wealth.
But were the Jews singled out? Were they saying, let's not give rights to middle class, or were they saying, let's not give rights to Jews?
Oh, in Germany, you needed the right to live wherever you lived. Special rights. You had to be approved to live in a town originally, and then it opens up a little bit. But then, the era of Jews in Germany generally did not live in ghettos. They generally lived, however, on a Jewish street, a Judengasse. And just they were all parts of what becomes Germany, but the largest one was Prussia. But they had been allowed to, you had to, at least until Frederick the Great in the mid-18th century, that's the 1700s, I distract myself by
They were kind of tight, they weren't allowed to move around from city to city.
that's right. Oh, well, they were. They could move from city to city, but when they came to a new city, they had to pay special taxes, only on them. And it was the same taxes, same tax would be paid on cattle if you brought them into the city. Okay, there was a sort of an import tax. And to stay in a city, you needed special permission, and there were cities especially in Europe, in Eastern Europe, cities that did not tolerate Jews, they tolerated Deus or something like that. I mean, that's gotten worse. But the, they were only there by permission, reading the permission of the local rulers. And then when for Jews to be allowed to be readmitted into England, that took an act of parliament too, but it wasn't fully enforced or fully equal. But they did nothing, so they had something. And so the freest country in Europe for Jews was England, farthest west. And that's how the Jews in the colonies get rights too, through naturalization, become naturalized British citizens, and they therefore have equal rights. Although from almost the very beginning, Jews have equal rights in this country, but we'll get to that certainly another day. Let's see, how are we doing here? You get emancipation in Germany and also in Austria-Hungary. In 1867, Austria-Hungary is 1867, 1868 in Hungary, and 1871 in Germany. But in German-speaking areas, there's a large, long process where Jews are fighting to get rights. And they wanted to do this by becoming more like everybody else, because everybody expected Jews eventually to convert. I mean, everybody, all the Christians expected Jews, if they wanted to be fully part of society, they had to convert to Christianity. Right? Well, not that many Jews are willing to convert, although some do. Okay, especially in the beginning of the late 18th century, you get a wave of conversions of Jews, and they were basically, for the most part, you always had Jews who converted to Christianity. Not too many, and it used to be that they were not the wealthy types, they used to be, domestic servants and that sort of thing. But now you're starting to get wealthy types who convert, and they were initially they're going to convert it in order to attend universities, and they didn't have equal rights yet, so that in order to get full equality, they had to become Christians. And it's like Heinrich Heine, who converted.
The Mendelssohns.
The Mendelssohns, well, yes. The Mendelssohn family is a very interesting family. Moses Mendelssohn comes from Dessau and comes to Berlin, needs special permission to live there, and he's looking for somebody in Berlin, Jewish family, of course. Jews only work for Jews, because Christians wouldn't hire Jews. But Mendelssohn had 6 kids, and I had 4 sons, 2 daughters, something like that. Anyhow, essentially half of his kids became Christians and the other half stayed Jewish. But he himself was a nominally Orthodox Jew in practice. He was an Orthoprax Jew. He's a philosopher who becomes liberated intellectually, but still practiced Judaism, and he expected, I guess, his kids to follow suit. But they don't. And but even after you convert to Christianity, it doesn't really make you accepted by everybody else. You might be a Christian, you might have the same rights as any other Christian, but socially you're often treated as a Jew, and you get farther ahead because you can have any job. Once you're a Christian, nothing is. It's like in Spain in the time of before the Spanish expulsion, lots of Spanish Jews became Christians, and then the government had a problem because if they're Christians, you can't treat them differently. So they become new Christians as opposed to old Christians. That's Spain. Okay, so in Germany, you have in the trying to get emancipated, you've got groups of wealthy Jews who are, especially in Berlin, who are converted to Christianity, and the rest of the people and the Jewish establishment, mainly the establishment, are really doesn't know what to do. Because these people are becoming, because they didn't get equal rights until, formally until 12 and then 1848 and then whatever. That on the way through, Jews, you lose some Jews that way, because Heine wanted, he saw that Christian conversion was the ticket, the entrance ticket into society. He discovered it wasn't true, but that's what he thought when he converted. But he had been committedly Jewish before that, and so had others in the same group that they convert. Now, when you convert, some Jews wanted to convert to Christianity but didn't want to follow Christian customs. That wasn't allowed. That was the 8th century. But so everybody else had to go through a nominal conversion and outwardly practice Christianity, and they did. They went. These weren't Marranos. They weren't secretly practicing Judaism, but outwardly practicing Christianity. They were outwardly practicing Christianity, and they no longer practiced Judaism because many of them had become estranged from Jewish practices when they became wealthy and were more part of society and learning how to be like everybody else in society. So if they do that, then some of them are inevitably going to convert. And so, but the liberals were willing to give Jews as Jews the right to vote. They did. And therefore, Jews stay loyal to liberals. Actually, in some cases, it's falling off the Liberal Party, but they, up until the Nazi era, Jews tried to stay liberals. But the liberal parties became more and more nationalistic. And then they started forming alliances with anti-Semitic parties. And they, once they have platform in an election that supports anti-Semitism, then it's harder for Jews to join them. So as we'll see, I guess next week we'll be focusing on this. The Jews turn farther left, they turn to socialism. Even though it's not in their economic interest to do so. Their economic interest still told them to vote liberal. But Jews don't always vote according to their economic interests. Which is, officially, if Jews only voted according to their economic interests, they should all be Republicans. It's long since, but they're not. Still liberals, mainly, but fewer and fewer than before. But Jews, there were just no other political parties that Jews could support, except the liberals at this time, because you didn't yet have socialists, because you didn't yet have workers having the right to vote. And if you don't have workers having the right to vote, how can you have a socialist party in parliament? Who would elect you? Maybe some Jews, but that's very far. So Jews stay liberals into the 20th century in many cases, and that is where their loyalties are. They really want to support a party that gives them rights, that emphasizes the rights of individuals to, so it's like American democracy. You recognize as individuals, you have the right as an individual. And so this was how they entered society as liberals. And many of them stayed liberals for much longer than you could have expected. But next week we'll talk more about, we're going to finish up some odds and ends that I meant to talk about here. So wasn't exactly wrong on my notes. But anyway, we'll deal a little bit more with Germany and German political parties. And also, it's interesting that in Central Europe, in Jewish communities, within the Jewish community, they're divided between the liberals and some socialists and Jewish nationalists, eventually Zionists. I mean, it used to be that the organized Jewish community was just made up of the wealthy, and they, of course, they were the ones that paid taxes and they made decisions. But gradually, under liberals, the middle classes get rights to vote. And then eventually it'll be the working classes getting rights to vote. Then you get universal suffrage. I'm sorry, universal male suffrage. I have to mention that every so often. But anyhow, by the 20th century, you've got universal male suffrage in England and in Germany and in France. Women don't get right to vote in France for a long time. But into the 20th century, you've got Jews trying to adhere to a liberal platform as long as they could, especially if they were upper middle class Jews. Not more interested to vote for socialists. But we'll talk about the socialists next time. Any questions?
Yeah, quick one. Christianity per se is not a religion. Pre-Martin Luther, Christianity was Catholicism.
But wait a minute, Catholicism is a religion.
Right.
I mean, there were Protestants and Catholics, and they're all Christians, so I lump
Right,
them
but-
together.
but
I
before-
don't mix them up.
Yeah, but my question was, in the time period we're talking about, when Jews converted to Christianity,
Mhm.
did they choose between
Catholics
various
and
Protestant
Protestants?
sects and
Yes.
Catholicism?
Well, in Germany, they become Protestants because Germany is Protestant, even though they got lots of Catholics. But the Catholics are discriminated against in Germany, not as much as Jews are, but they are sort of almost second-class citizens, not so much as Jews are. But in Austria, for example, in Vienna, you got a very high conversion rate by the 20th century, and a remarkable number, I mean, they all converted to Catholicism because the Austro-Hungarian Empire was Catholic. But it's become a remarkable number of Jews in Vienna in the 20th century who converted to Protestantism. And that's not what you would do in Vienna because everybody else isn't Protestant. It isn't Protestant, right? It's Catholic. So, but Jews, when they convert either generally in a Lutheran church or in a Catholic church, depending on which country they're in and who they're marrying, and often, well, Jewish women convert in order to marry. Jewish men convert in order to do better in business. Now, how many of them are sincere? Well, you don't quite know that. But once they convert, they're Christians. And otherwise, if they don't convert, they're still Jewish, no matter what they believe or don't believe. Even if they're officially without religion, the Jewish community will still count these people as Jewish. So, although they're not counting the statistics of the community, because they will not, because the government keeps track of what religion you are and which religious group you belong to, because in 19th, 20th century Germany and Austria, everybody paid religious tax. And so you're registered as a Jew, as a Protestant, as a Catholic, and it's not so much by denominations, because conversion to Protestantism, you were converting to Protestantism, or you weren't converting to Calvinism. Now, if you happen to live in a Calvinist country, if you become a Christian, you're probably going to be a Calvinist because those are the churches you can belong to. But I think it's interesting, in Germany, the word for Protestants is evangelic. So it sounds like they're all, Pentecostalists, but they're not. The evangelicals are the Protestant. And so Protestant countries, they become Protestants, Catholic countries, they become Catholics. And they do so for different reasons, depending on who they are and where they're coming from. But the the opportunities become much greater for Jews once they start to speak the language of the land and to be like everybody else. It's harder for them to remain Jewish and still be happy about that. So some convert. Surprising number don't convert. That's even true up to the Nazi era. Yes, some German Jews and some Austrian Jews converted to Christianity, tried to leave of the, it's not going to do them any good if they're doing it in the 1930s, but if they do so earlier, it's remarkable that more people don't, and more men convert, more women convert than men. Originally it's more men than women, than women than men, but they convert, as I say, for different reasons. But they convert into whatever religion people are practicing around them. And but I guess for some it was harder to become a Catholic than to become a Protestant, so they became a Protestant. But that's the way it was going. Any other questions? Okay, well, I threw a lot.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I threw a lot of
Thank you,
stuff at
Harriet.
you, but I'll pick up towards the end of that again. And I'll go with the